This is part 2 of the lecture on 18th century colonization. Section 3, the state in 18th century Europe, France and England compared. Farbonnet makes clear that trade and population are what colonization is for. Over the course of the 18th century, Europeans increasingly sought to expand their colonial possessions. In order to understand this trend, we need more information about the material conditions in Europe in that time period. We'll take a look at the changes in the total population of France and England, in particular over the course of the 18th century, and then the growth of the English and French economies over that same time frame. Then, finally, at the wages that workers were paid. Taken together, this will provide the elements on the basis of which historians and social scientists have tried to understand 18th century colonization. The big picture account is that in the 18th century, Britain begins the trajectory that in the 19th century results in it becoming the economically and military dominant force in the world. The changes in population, in GDP per capita, all begin to trend in the same way. We will also look at a couple of other data to try to understand some of the ways that these changes have been explained. Over the course of the long 18th century, Britain's population grew from around 8.5 million in 1700 to 21 million in 1820. Over that same time span, France's population also grew, but not nearly at the same accelerated pace, from 21 million people in 1700 to 31,246,000 in 1820. Logic alone dictates that this increase had to be accompanied by an increase in the material conditions for survival. Minimally, food, shelter, and clothing, but also a great deal more is also required to sustain the larger population. From the table, we can see that while France remained the most populous nation in Europe, the United Kingdom's relative share of the total population grew considerably. There remains a great deal of disagreement about the reasons, mechanisms, and structures that contributed to this population increase. Family size, internal migration, urbanization, improved sanitation, among others, all undoubtedly factor into this macro trend. What is clear is that at the same time as this population increase occurred, a statistically more modest change was happening. The increase in the size of the respective economies of the two nations, the total value of the goods and services produced, that is the GDP, the gross domestic product. On this table, we see that in 1500, the size of the British economy, as measured by the GDP, is a touch more than a quarter of the size of the French economy. And that by the beginning of the 20th century, by the beginning of the 19th century, its GDP passes that of France. And so in a mere 300 years, the United Kingdom's economy has grown astonishingly and has overtaken France's as the leading economy in Europe. In the next slide, we see the GDPs of France and Great Britain as a percentage of the overall size of the Western European economies. France maintains its relative size, but Great Britain's share of the GDP of Western Europe is seen to have grown from slightly more than half of what France's share was at the beginning of our period to overtaking France as having the largest share. Broadening the context further now, we can zoom out and include as a frame of reference the global GDP to see where Great Britain, France, and Western Europe stood in relation to the rest of the world. And so we see that France maintains approximately, even though its GDP is growing, its percentage of the world GDP stays the same. The world GDP is growing at the same rate as France's GDP. Whereas Britain's GDP, Britain's share of the global GDP doubles over this same time period. Finally, or rather next, let's look at two other contributors to the global economy at this time period, China and India. China and India's economies up to 1820 are by far larger than those of France and Great Britain. Indeed, larger than the total economy of the 12 Western European countries. The date 1820 in the context of the growth of the world economy is pivotal. It's around 1820 or so that occurred what Kenneth Pomerantz described as the Great Divergence, according to which after 1820, for the first time in human history, some societies began to experience what has turned out, so far at least, to be sustained long-term economic growth. Global historical GDP data supports the proposition that up until 1820, national and global GDP rates fluctuated up and down, but never prior to 1820 were there long-term, seemingly permanent increases in GDP per capita anywhere in the world. So 1820, from an economic history point of view, is an inflection point in human history. These changes occurred first in England and soon after in the US, Germany, and France, only subsequently followed by other countries. It's in the context of this takeoff around 1820 that 18th century colonization can be properly understood. This takeoff fulfills Forbonnet's expectations of the benefit to the colonizing nation of engaging in a colonial activity. Now, a feature of this graph is that it shows the GDP, it shows not the national GDP of these countries, but the GDP per capita, that is the gross domestic product of a country divided by the number of its inhabitants. Looking now at the GDP per capita over the time period sheds even more light on the broader picture. Recall from 2 slides ago that while in 1700, India and China were still producing 5 or 6 times more goods and services than were being produced in France and England, in the latter 2 countries, a century of very significant improvement in the growth of the productivity in these economies occurred. Much more value per person was being produced, and the rate of that growth was only just taking off. So what? What's the significance of this? Fast forward to 3 years ago, and we see where things stand today. This is the Great Divergence. Forbonnet's prescriptions were followed. The surplus population and the society that the colonial economy supported are not competing with England and France, even 200 years after they managed to free themselves from the political control that the European military advantages gave them. Not only did Haiti and Jamaica never catch up, but India and China have not yet either. What explains this difference? Natural resources and technology alone cannot be the whole answer, since the amount of unexploited natural resources were the same when the large Asian economies were producing at the same GDP per capita prior to the takeoff in the late 17th, early 20th century. Technological advances alone are also ruled out, as historians have been able to show that the level of technological knowledge available for production was again at least, and in a number of important ways, even more advanced in the large Asian economies compared to France and England and Western Europe at the time. Economic historians have argued that it is in changes in institutions that the causes of difference is to be sought, and in particular, in political institutions. As Darren Acemoglu puts it, quote, "We advance the hypothesis that Western European growth during this period resulted, in part, from the indirect effects of international trade on institutional development. Although there were some improvements in economic institutions in the late medieval and early modern period, rapid economic development did not begin until the emergence of political institutions providing secure property rights to a broader segment of society and allowing free entry into profitable businesses." The title of a paper published in 2019 is even clearer. Democracy Causes Growth. We turn now to take a briefer look at the changes in political institutions in France and England and their impact on colonization. We saw in the first part of the lecture that already in the 18th century, it was understood that European nations competed for access to the wealth potential that they saw in an expanded colonization. They did so on a competitive basis, and that this led to wars among the different colonizing nations. These wars were increasingly expensive, and this became a permanent feature of the financial concerns of the various European nations. One way of characterizing the difference between the Ancien Régime and early modern Europe is in the Ancien Régime, war was the exclusive concern of the aristocracy. Aristocrats, the nobles, supplied the nation with the means to protect itself from outside threats. The other segments of society provided the materially necessary means to allow the aristocracy to preserve the nations. Georges Duby, a French historian of medieval Europe, described it as the aristocrats lived to fight, and the rest of society, the aristocrats lived to fight, the priests existed in order to pray, and the peasants existed in order to work. The other segments of society provided the material, right. In the long view, this was the peasants producing food. This third class was the peasants producing food, and a tiny but growing urban-based class organizing the exchange of what little local surplus happened to be produced, along with very small-scale manufacturing of some luxury items for aristocrats, and a tiny trade in locally manufactured agricultural tools. By the 17th century, the technological demands of warfare required a significant ramping up of local production of military equipment, and increasingly for goods not available within the national boundaries, and therefore requiring cash, and more importantly, in the long run, instruments of credit. The aristocrats, as a military force, were required to furnish and pay for their own troops and equipment in the Ancien Régime, which meant that they increasingly needed to extract more and more money or credit from the productivity of their only resource, that is, their landed estates and the serfs who were tied to those lands. Over the course of the early modern period, at different speeds, but following the general pattern described by Maria in her absolutism lecture, the dominant aristocratic families separate themselves as central powers with constitutionally distinct authority and responsibility at a national level. They consolidate themselves as monarchies. These monarchies are also funded by the resources that their authority allows them to extract from the surplus production of the non-aristocratic classes in their societies. The long-run picture, that is the transition from feudal Europe to early modern Europe, is a transition from feudal dues over time being converted into taxes, and the personal feudal ties between serfs on the one hand and their lords on the other are transformed into local and eventually provincial and then national identities, increasingly understood, described, and enforced as abstract legal citizenship. In addition to increased military expenses, administrative costs were increasingly associated with an expansion in the regulation of trade and the financing that internal trade over distances requires, mainly involving the standardization of units of measurement and of coinage. The next slide, this slide, gives a snapshot of the differences between the total revenues that Britain and France collected near the end of the 18th century, along with the distribution of that revenue into direct and indirect taxes. We see that even though Britain had a significantly smaller population, it was able to collect nearly as much in revenue as the French crown could manage with a much larger population and economy. This translates into per capita taxation rates that were much higher in Britain than in France. This difference was the result of the success with which the aristocratic classes in France had been able to resist repeated royal attempts to tax their revenues. As Richard Bonney puts it, yet the paradox underlying French power, which threatened to undermine the whole structure, was that the country with the largest number of taxpayers in Western Europe also had, until 1790, the largest number and highest proportion of fiscal exemptions. This turned out to be a problem because these privileges became so deeply entrenched because they were multi-dimensional, granted as they were to different levels of society, to institutions, to provinces and regions, and to social groups and individuals. This multi-layered regime of privilege created intolerable tensions within government itself and between government and the rest of society. These tensions eventually resulted in the overthrowing of the French monarchy, by and large at the direction of, and even more certainly in the longer term interests of, the rising bourgeois class. These are the political institutional changes identified by Acemoglu in his work on the relation between economic growth and institutionalized social organization. In the article I quote above, Acemoglu describes his approach as, quote, a marriage of Marx and neoclassical models. The neoclassical component is a focus on the securing of a legal regime organized to guarantee private property rights for citizens at the expense of ancient royal prerogatives that had, for the most part, characterized European societies since the late Middle Ages. The Marx component, according to Acemoglu, is to see in the rise of a bourgeois class to political hegemony across the full spectrum of government power, an independent factor to which economic growth, which contributes to economic growth. The problem with Acemoglu's account of political change is that it doesn't do justice to the multifaceted nature of the forces at work in the rebalancing of European society in the 18th century. To pick just one aspect of the changes, we see in the next slide that while taxation is increasing over the entire century, real wages realized by workers across most European cities were in decline for the 18th century. This decline in wages generated real hardship in the working classes in England and France, and was part of what made colonization an increasingly attractive option, both for the wage-suppressed workers and also for employers, noble and bourgeois alike. It offered this in exactly the way Farbonnet described in his Encyclopédie article, by modulating the levels of so-called surplus population. In addition to stabilizing the labor market, by acting as a pressure relief valve on that population, colonization further enhanced the hand of anti-royal forces in England and in France, with much more success in England than in France, accounting at least in part for the former's greater success in that century in converting the surplus production into capital that was further reinvested, generating over the course of that century the significant difference in per capita GDP that we saw in one of the earlier slides. We must now return to the version of this transition understood by economic historians. In a different paper covering some of the same topics, Acemoglu wrote, our hypothesis is that Atlantic trade, the opening of the sea routes to, these are his words, the New World, Africa, and Asia, and the building of colonial empires contributed to the process of Western European growth between 1500 and 1850, not only through direct economic effects, but also indirectly by inducing fundamental institutional change. Atlantic trade altered the balance of political power by enriching and strengthening commercial interests outside the royal circle including various overseas merchants, slave traders, and various colonial planters. Through this channel, it contributed to the emergence of political institutions protecting merchants against royal power. Long-term economic growth is caused, in this view, because the rising bourgeoisie is not only able to translate the profits of the Atlantic trade, including crucially the trade in enslaved people and the commodities they are forced to produce, but in the long run, far more importantly, because along the way, this class, in the pursuit of their class interests, secure for themselves and their commercial needs a new institutional framework, not just laws guaranteeing property rights, but through Parliament, eventually, control of the military, of the Navy, and in fact, control of government. The trouble with Acemoglu's account of the rise of the bourgeoisie is that he gives an inadequate account of the nature of the rise of the bourgeoisie, describing it solely in terms of a struggle between the bourgeoisie and the royal circle, and neglecting the crucial role that the bourgeoisie played in transforming the peasant class in Britain and elsewhere from agricultural tenant producers to landless proletarians needing a wage to feed themselves and their families. Acemoglu describes the relation between the merchant class's economic interests and their political ambitions as external to each other. Christian Lund offers a different perspective that sees the two areas as interconnected. I therefore present a series of propositions about the interconnectedness of authority and rights. I suggest that property and citizenship on the one hand, and authority on the other, are mutually constitutive. This takes us through questions of how notions of ownership are conceptualized, how political identities are constructed, how taxes are recovered, how conflicts are adjudicated, how violence and other sanctions are exercised and legitimated. It is this last part in particular that is crucially absent from Acemoglu's account. As the merchants succeeded in securing their institutional property regime, they needed to expand their profits As the merchants succeeded in securing the institutional property regime they needed to expand their profits, they also succeeded in securing and even expanding the use of violence. Acemoglu describes his account as a mix of Marx and neoclassical economics. Perhaps he missed this passage in Marx's Capital, Volume 1. Hence, the historical movement which changes the producers into wage workers appears, on the one hand, as their emancipation from serfdom and from the fetters of the guilds, and this side alone exists for our bourgeois historians. But on the other hand, these new freedmen became sellers of themselves only after they had been robbed of all their own means of production and of all the guarantees of existence afforded by the old feudal arrangements. And the history of this, their expropriation, is written in the annals of humanity in letters of blood and fire. A few pages later, Marx makes the connection to colonization. The different momenta of primitive accumulation distribute themselves now more or less in chronological order, particularly over Spain, Portugal, Holland, France, and England. In England, at the end of the 17th century, they arrive at a systematical combination, embracing the colonies, the national debt, the modern mode of taxation, and the protectionist system. These methods depend on brute force, for example, the colonial system, but they all employ the power of the state, the concentrated and organized force of society, to hasten hothouse fashion the process of transformation of the feudal mode of production into the capitalist mode, and to shorten the transition. Force is the midwife of every old society pregnant with a new one. It is itself an economic power. In the final part of the lecture, I will look at a few of the ways that colonization in the 18th century participated in these transformations of Britain and France.